to watch this short video. It's about 12 minutes, but I really want you to pay attention. I chose this video because the educator in it is actually, and you guys might know the book, you might know the author, he is the author of The Fault in Our Stars, which is really popular right now. I saw the movie, I loved it. And he's a teacher, and he does a lot of videos. He blogs and does YouTube videos and everything, so if you ever are kind of curious about something or you're unsure in class, you can always YouTube this stuff because he has a lot of the information available to us.
Hi, I'm John Green. This
Can
is
everyone hear that?
Course U.S. History, and today we're going to look at one of the most important
Can
periods
someone get
of
the lights
American
for me,
social
please?
history,
Matt.
the 1950s. Why is it so important? Well, first, because it saw the advent of the greatest invention in human history, television.
Mr. Green, I like TV. By the way, you're from the future. How does the X-Files end? Are there aliens or no aliens?
No spoilers, me from the past. You're going to have to go to college and watch the X-Files get terrible just like I did. No, it's mostly important because of the Civil Rights Movement. We're going to talk about some of the heroic figures like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, but much of the real story is about the thousands of people you've never heard of who fought to make America more inclusive. But before we look at the various changes that the Civil Rights Movement was pushing for, we should spend a little time looking at the society that they were trying to change. The 1950s has been called a period of consensus, and I suppose it was, at least for the white males who wrote about it, and who all agreed that the 1950s were fantastic for white males. Consensus culture was caused first by the Cold War. People were hesitant to criticize the United States for fear of being branded a communist, and second, by affluence. Increasing prosperity meant that more people didn't have as much to be critical of. And this widespread affluence was something new in the United States. Between 1946 and 1960, Americans experienced a period of economic expansion that saw standards of living rise and gross national product more than double. And unlike many previous American economic expansions, much of the growing prosperity in the 50s was shared by ordinary working people who saw their wages rise. To quote our old friend Eric Foner, by 1960, an estimated 60% of Americans enjoyed what the government defined as a middle-class standard of living. And this meant that an increasing number of Americans had access to things like television and air conditioning and dishwashers and air travel. That doesn't really seem like a bonus. Anyway, despite the fact that they were being stuffed into tiny metal cylinders and hurtled through the air, most Americans were happy because they had, like, indoor plumbing and electric.
Okay, now that's an awkward place to stop, but I want you to think of how the economy might have been affecting what people were thinking about. You know, he's talking about most Americans were happy, but we're talking about the Civil Rights Movement. So if most Americans were happy, how could something like the Civil Rights Movement be so prevalent and really pushing people to think differently and wanting change? Just keep that in mind, all right?
Electricity. The 1950s was the era of suburbanization. The number of homes in the United States doubled during the decade, which had the pleasant side effect of creating lots of construction jobs. A classic example of suburbanization.
Are we actually supposed to be filling this out, or is this for later?
We're going to do that directly after the video, okay?
I wasn't sure if we're supposed to be taking notes.
Yeah, because I do have a timeline for you guys that's also in there for visual reference for later, just in case, because the video moves a little faster with some of the graphics. I don't want you guys to get confused. I want you to really watch and think of big ideas and important people right now. But we will get back to that, okay?
Okay.
Because we do have another video after this to view.
Levittown in New York, where 10,000 almost identical homes were built and became home to 40,000 people almost overnight. And living further from the city meant that more Americans needed cars, which was good news for Detroit, where cars were being churned out with the expectation that Americans would replace them every 2 years. By 1960, 80% of Americans owned at least one car, and 14% had two or more. And car culture changed the way that Americans lived and shopped. I mean, it gave us shopping malls and drive-through restaurants and the backseat makeout session. I mean, high school me didn't get the backseat makeout session, but other people did. I did get the Burger King drive-through, though. And lots of it. Our whole picture of the American standard of living, with its abundance of consumer goods and plentiful services, was established in the 1950s. And so for many people, this era was something of a golden age, especially when we look back on it today with nostalgia. But there were critics, even at the time. So when we say the 1950s were an era of consensus, one of the things we're saying is that there wasn't much room for debate about what it meant to be an American.
Now, I also want to clarify one other aspect right now. He's talking about the 1950s, but what's going on in the 1950s is kind of setting the stage for what goes on early in the 1960s. The Civil Rights Movement didn't just happen overnight. is what he's kind of setting up. There's a lot of things going on, and he's kind of trying to compare and contrast the time and how people felt and what was going on and what was the reality right then and there. Okay?
People agreed on the American values: individualism, respect for private property, and belief in equal opportunity. The key problem was that we believed in equal opportunity but didn't actually provide it. But some people were
Really
concerned
important,
that the
guys.
cookie-cutter
Think of that
vision
one.
of the good life and the celebration of the middle-class lifestyle was displacing other conceptions of citizenship. Like the sociologist C. Wright Mills described a combination of military, corporate, and political leaders as a power elite whose control over government and the economy was such as to make democracy an afterthought. In The Lonely Crowd, sociologist David Reisman criticized Americans for being conformist and lacking the rich inner life necessary to be truly independent. And John Kenneth Galbraith questioned an affluent society that would pay for new cars and new missiles, but not for new schools. And we can't mention the 1950s without discussing teenagers, since this was the decade that gave us rock and roll and rock stars like Bill Haley and the Comets, Buddy Holly and the Crickets, and Elvis Presley and his hips.
He's
So
at
you might
least
have
one
noticed
person
something
I hope
about
you
all
guys
those
are
critics of the
familiar
1950s
with.
that I just mentioned.
Anybody Holly.
They were all white dudes. Now, we're going to be talking about women in the 1950s and 1960s next week because their liberation movement began a bit later. But what most people call the civil rights movement really did begin in the 50s. While the 1950s were something of a golden age for many blue and white collar workers, it was hardly a period of expanding opportunities for African Americans. Rich